Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 8.5 for Chapter 8 for PSY 235, Social Psychology. In this part of the chapter, we'll be looking at one of the most famous and perhaps infamous studies in the history of social psychology, and that has to do with Stanley Milgram's research on obedience to authority. Now, obedience is an interesting construct because in virtually every culture, some degree of obedience to authority is expected. That means it's a social norm that's highly valued. Even in the most independence-oriented Western cultures, we still expect obedience. Obedience to norms on the ground in our own cultural context. This norm of obedience is something that we are taught to internalize from a very early age. While it does vary from culture to culture in terms of its centrality and the degree to which people obey social norms, every culture expects that people will follow norms, rules, and laws, even when authority figures aren't around. So, for example, when we drive on the highways, the vast majority of people follow the basic rules. Most of us go a little too fast. However, most of us obey most of the rules, which is really kind of remarkable that you can have hundreds and hundreds of people with you on the road, and you're all doing basically the same thing and playing by the rules. Now, how do you know this? Because when that rare person who's just gunning down the road 20 miles over the speed limit, dodging in and out of lanes, that person is irritating to you because they're not doing what they're supposed to, and they're putting everybody else at risk. The downside, so that's the positive side, cultures don't function very well when there's no kind of structure, when rules and laws and norms are just dismissed. Cultures just fall apart. So that's the good side. On the downside, sometimes people will obey orders or directives or requirements from an authority figure that can lead them to making very bad moral decisions. So, some of the original historical events that were motivating people like Stanley Milgram to do their research was to figure out why some of these really dramatically horrible things had happened during his time period. Now, Milgram did his research from the early 1960s through the mid-1970s. It was an elaborate research program. There were multiple iterations in many, many locations, but his motivation was really to try and make sense of why, say, Nazi Germany actually happened. Why were so many people willing to participate in the Holocaust? He was also really interested in why something like the My Lai massacre would occur, which was a situation during the Vietnam War where civilians were just slaughtered by a unit of the U.S. military at the behest of their leadership. So, why wouldn't the military personnel, why wouldn't they say, no, this is a violation of military code, we don't do this, but instead, why would they follow the orders of people telling them to wipe out the town, for example? So that's where his motivation came from. In this video, it's a fairly old video, but it does have the archival footage that Milgram's lab put together to educate people about the nature of the research. So what Milgram was doing, and the footage there is from the original design. Now, what experimental psychologists often do is they'll set up their first wave in a research program to test the strongest version of the manipulation. So what they did was they set it up what so that they thought they would get the maximum level of obedience, and that's really what they found. So most of Milgram's participants followed along the suggestions and the pressure from an authority figure who was a man, neatly groomed in a lab coat with a clipboard. So the experimenter kind of represented this high authority in a major Ivy League school, in a laboratory, in a psych building on campus. So you had the authority not just of the experimenter, but the institution as well. Like in your mind, you would be thinking, how could something horrible happen in this context? And having the experimenter be sitting in the room with you, despite that, they're not holding a gun to your head to make you do stuff, but still they're right there. And remember back to, social pressure, when a person asking you or attempting to change your attitude is right in front of you, they are more impactful. And that's something that Milgram took advantage of in this case. He also separated the learner, who was an actor. This was a person who was hired by Milgram's research team to play the role of the learner. The naive subjects were always in the role of the teacher. And they were recruited via a newspaper ad where they were told, this is an experiment looking at the effect of punishment on memory. And, they come in, so they don't know it's a study of obedience to authority, obviously. So we have to tell them the cover story, that they're studying punishment and memory. They have the naive learner watch the demonstration of the shock generator. So that creates realism. That creates naive realism for the participant. Then they close the door. The learner is on one side of a wall. You can't see them. And the teacher is on the other side of the wall with the experimenter. And then there's the big shock generator that you were shown at the beginning of the film clip. And the researcher is steadfast in his instructions. He is repetitive. He doesn't argue with the naive subject. He doesn't answer their questions. He just continues to exert steadfast influence. The average maximum shock delivered was about 360 volts. Now, recognize that no electric shocks were actually being delivered. It was a fake machine, and the learners' responses were from a script. So every participant got the exact same response from the learner every time. About, a little over 60% of the participants, so close to 2/3 of the participants, went all the way to the end of the shock board, which would be the equivalent of 450 volts if they were delivering actual shocks. Now, when he looked at the findings and then put them out into the public, they were shocking to people. And lots of people just went after Milgram, all kinds of criticisms, because he found that 80% of the participants continued to give shocks even after the learner appeared to cry out in pain. And, in a later manipulation, which you saw in the video clip, he added the statement of "my heart is bothering me," expecting that would reduce obedience, but it really didn't, not by very much. Now, as I said, Milgram, when he put these findings out into the real world and got them published, the popular press really got angry and tried to argue that Milgram was faking the data, that his research was wrong, because this was a time period where the public kind of attitude, so you have to go back to the 50s, the World War II era, where a lot of the American public really kind of bought into the idea that it was some flaw in the German people that caused the Holocaust to occur. And Milgram just didn't believe it. He thought it had much more to do with social pressure and social influence and the way in which the government in that country chose to make decisions to compel their populace to be in some ways supportive. Now, the question becomes, did these teachers, did they believe what was happening? They did. While it's kind of argued that Milgram did no debriefing, he didn't do debriefing in the sense that we do it today. There were no institutional review boards in place at that time period, but he did interview many of his participants after their participation. There's a lot of urban legends out there about how some of the participants lost their minds, died by suicide, or became murderers. None of that is factual, despite the fact that those rumors kind of float around in the atmosphere all the time. Most of the participants reported fascination with their own behavior. They were, not happy that they had been obedient to that extent. And they were very, very relieved when they were introduced to the actor who played the learner and found out that he was okay. They were relieved by that. Some participants were distressed, but there's no reports of any long-term issues that these people had. Now, Milgram did a lot of different versions of the study. So the one that you saw the video clip of was the original. And that's where you find the 63% obedience rate going all the way to the end of the shock panel. When they moved the experiment to a vacant office building off campus, you get a reduction, a pretty significant reduction in obedience rates, meaning that more participants quit before the end and left. When the teacher was asked to physically touch the learner and put their hand on what's called a shock plate, so, imagine just an electrified piece of metal, and, I laugh because I can't imagine doing this to another person. Full obedience drops down to about 30%. So that's, more than half of what you got in the original experimenter design. If the experimenter is positioned outside the room and only communicates by phone, you get another precipitous drops down to nearly 20%. When you have an ally, remember back to some of the research we talked about previously, if you have a Confederate who will be with you and start to resist the persuasive attempts of the experimenter, then obedience rates go down again to 10%. When you have the teacher given the power to decide how much shock they want to deliver, you get the lowest levels of obedience when people are given more power to make their own decisions. So what Milgram was really trying to do, he wasn't trying to say human beings are basically immoral. And that was what a lot of the newspapers reported. Milgram is trying to make us all out to be monsters. And that's not what he was trying to do. He was trying to show that we have a particular vulnerability. And if we engineer the situation carefully, we can create monstrous behavior. He didn't argue that people were monsters. He argued that people are vulnerable to social influence of a particular kind. And if we learn about those situational variables, we should know how to prevent disasters, horrific disasters like the Holocaust, like the My Lai massacre. So let's take apart the various aspects of social influence that were in play in the Milgram research. First, there's informational social influence. And remember that informational social influence is about us being being inexperienced with a particular context. Like, nobody has a shock generator in their house that they're going to use on people. You may have a shock collar for a dog to keep them in your yard, but we don't have this experience where you're sitting in a laboratory. We just don't experience that. So it's a very confusing situation. There are competing ambiguous demands, as your authors put it, and it's unclear how to figure out what's going on. In that kind of an ambiguous situation, the expert is the authority figure, and our tendency is going to be to look to that person for guidance. Notice how many times in the video clip that naive subject turns and looks at the researcher for guidance. and says things like, you got to check on that guy in there. I don't think he's all right. He's not responding anymore. He even gets up at one point and says, look, you got to go look in on that guy. I think something's happened to him. And then the experimenter, who is the authority figure, says, please continue, as if nothing's wrong. So in your head, as the naive participant, you're like, he's not nervous. The researcher isn't even anxious. It must be fine, right? Now, on the normative side, participants, in Milgram's opinion, conformed to the wrong norm. So the norm is obey authority. There's a researcher in the room. They have a lab coat, which gives them this scientific authority. They have their clipboard, which it enhances that authority. It's a clean-cut, professional-looking man, also influences authority. So the norm in play is obey. What would be the right norm? The right norm would be don't hurt other people, right? So in that context, it is so powerful. There's this heightened level of informational confusion, but there's also a powerful social norm of do what authorities tell you to do. And it's not that, a full 30% don't fully comply with the authority figure. And as you change the context to shift the norms, you see less and less and less obedience. Now, there are lots of reasons that we obey. One of them is that idea of conforming to the wrong norm. If you have a really fast pace in an experimental situation, which is what happened with Milgram, or if it's in the real world, let's say you're on the battlefield. It's confusing, it's chaotic, it's fast-paced, decisions have to be made quickly, and people have no time to reflect. And that can lead you very quickly to obedience without reflection, where you're conforming to the wrong norm and violating other kinds of moral codes and norms and expectations. There's also a pattern of self-justification. What Milgram designed was really kind of patterned after the way several fascist regimes have been found to train people to do torture. And I know this sounds really bizarre, but there's all kinds of records. Totalitarian regimes have a tendency to want to keep records. And what some archival researchers found in Italy was that there was a very clear protocol for training new recruits and deciding which ones of them could become torturers during a fascist regime. And what they would do was start them off slow. So Milgram started them with low levels of shock that weren't too painful. And then, with that fast pace, they're going to end up with moving them to an accelerated level of pressure. And over time, what you end up with is a loss of personal responsibility. So conforming to the wrong norm is exacerbated by the fast pace and the absence of time to reflect. And then you get, dissonance reduction, where you're self-justifying because you've started at these low levels. Why would I shock a person all along and then suddenly say, no, it's not okay to shock them? I've already been shocking them. So you might kick in, dissonance reduction kicks in and says, well, this is what's required, so I need to do it. And that creates internal pressure to continue being obedient. And that will then cause you to redefine your level of personal responsibility and deflect it onto the institution and onto the researcher, as opposed to the responsibility being yours. So these obedience studies, your researchers described the fact that Milgram's program of research is considered an important contribution to the field, but it was very, very controversial. Out in the public atmosphere, it prompted a lot of discussions about ethics in research, about informed consent, about debriefing, about the norm of the importance of protecting the rights of research participants. So, in a post-Milgram era, we do have institutional review boards, which really, a lot of people mistakenly believe that Milgram caused us to have these boards. The boards were already in place, but they were largely in place in medical research facilities. And they had to be expanded to include all kinds of research involving human participants. So, keep that in mind. The research there are lots of things you can criticize about it tactically, but the findings have really held up over time if you use the design that he used. There have been follow-ups of Milgram's research, but a lot of the discourse has been about the ethics and the difficulties that people had kind of reconciling themselves to the findings. He has been criticized for this use of deception, and using a cover story in social psychology is normative. I do it in my research. Now, I'm not setting people up to feel like they may have killed someone. Absolutely not. I usually just hide my hypotheses from my research participants so they don't know exactly what I'm doing and testing. Now, why do you need to do that? Because if he had told his participants, we want to see how long you'll obey, they're just not going to behave authentically. Milgram was also criticized for not engaging in full informed consent, in making it very crystal clear to the participants that they could leave the experiment whenever they wanted without consequence. And, really making sure that there was a full debriefing so that participants understood what was being done, why it was being done, what kind of findings were being looked for, and so on. Now, recent studies have involved less imposing of psychological distress, a lot more pre-screening of participants, and there are some impacts on what's found under those circumstances, but the findings have been basically the same. Now, there have been documentaries put out there. At one point, the BBC in the UK had a TV series where they were purportedly reenacting some of the work, but the findings they hold. Unlike Zimbardo's research, which is no longer being covered, you may have heard of the Zimbardo prison study. It doesn't show up in this textbook any longer, primarily because of the uncovering of really horrible kind of information about the way the study was conducted and Zimbardo's own behavior in that process. Unlike that study, where replicating the findings has been dicey at best, the obedience studies, Milgram's design, even with different methods, where you have more limits on the potential for inflicting psychological distress and more screening of the participants, full informed consent, and debriefing, you still get basically the same findings. Now, the modern studies don't go as far. They don't go to the point where the participant is likely to presume that the learner is dead. They don't go that far because that's seen as violating the rights of the participants to such a degree that it's not permissible. But you still have the same basic level of obedience in play. So what that shows is that the more aware we are of our vulnerabilities in terms of persuasion and conformity and obedience, the better off we are in resisting those attempts to conform our behavior to the wrong norms. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 8.